The crack of a gunshot echoed across the valley as Nora Nichols ducked behind her father's weathered barn, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild Mustang. It was 1878 in the unforgiving territory of Wyoming, and at 18 years old, she had just witnessed something she was never meant to see. "He'll kill me if he finds out," she whispered, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp autumn air. Her father, Samuel Nichols, was not a man who tolerated witnesses to his crimes, even if that witness was his only daughter. The Nichols ranch sat isolated against the sprawling landscape, 15 miles from the nearest town of Clearwater. What had once been her sanctuary had become her prison over the past year. Ever since her mother's death from fever had left her alone with a father who transformed from strict to tyrannical. Nora peered around the corner of the barn, her golden brown hair falling across her face as she watched her father and his two associates dragging a body toward the ravine that cut through their property. The dead man was a cattle buyer who had arrived earlier that day, his pockets full of cash meant to purchase her father's herd. Now he would never return to his family. Carefully, she backed away and slipped into the barn, where she quickly gathered her few precious belongings into a small sack: her mother's silver hairbrush, a faded photograph, and the small amount of money she had managed to hide away over the years. She had to leave, tonight, before her father discovered she had witnessed the murder. As Nora crept toward the stables at the far end of the barn, the heavy wooden doors swung open. Her father stood silhouetted against the fading light, his imposing figure blocking her escape. "Going somewhere, girl?" Samuel's voice was as cold as the approaching winter. I was just checking on Maple," she lied, referring to her chestnut mare. Samuel's eyes narrowed as he noticed the sack clutched in her trembling hands. "You saw, didn't you?" It wasn't a question, but an accusation. Nora backed away, her eyes searching for an escape route. "I don't know what you're talking about, Pa. Don't lie to me." He lunged forward, grabbing her arm with such force that she cried out in pain. "What did you see?" "Nothing, I swear." But Samuel Nichols knew his daughter too well. He dragged her from the barn and toward the house, his fingers digging into her flesh. "You're not going anywhere, Nora. Not now, not ever." For the first time, Nora truly saw the monster her father had become. The grief of losing her mother hadn't just changed him, it had unleashed something that had always lurked beneath the surface. "You can't keep me here," she protested, struggling against his iron grip. "Watch me." He pushed her through the front door and up the narrow staircase to her bedroom. With a final shove, he sent her stumbling into the room. "You'll stay put until I figure out what to do with you." The door slammed shut, and Nora heard the distinct sound of the key turning in the lock. She ran to the window, but in the past year her father had nailed wooden planks across it, claiming it was to keep out the cold. Now she understood the true reason. She was trapped. For 3 days, Nora remained locked in her bedroom with only brief visits from her father, who brought her meager meals and watched with cold eyes as she ate. He said little, but his silence spoke volumes. He was deciding her fate, and she knew it wouldn't be merciful. On the 4th day, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Nora heard unfamiliar voices downstairs. Pressing her ear against the door, she strained to listen. "The cattle look good, Nichols," a deep voice said, "but I was expecting to meet your buyer. Morris was supposed to be here days ago." "Morris had a change of plans," her father replied smoothly. "That's why I sent for you, Sutton. His loss is your gain." Through a crack in the floorboards, Nora could see 2 men standing in the parlor below. One was her father, and the other was a tall stranger dressed in trail-worn clothes, his hat pushed back on his head to reveal dark hair and a face weathered by sun and wind. "Zane Sutton," the stranger introduced himself, extending his hand. "Just passing through on my way north with my outfit." Nora held her breath as she watched them shake hands. There was something about the way Zane Sutton carried himself, alert, cautious, that suggested he wasn't as easily fooled as her father might hope. "You've got good timing," Samuel said. "I've got 50 head ready to move, and I need the cash." As they discussed the price, Nora's mind raced. This man, this Zane Sutton, might be her only chance at escape. Somehow she had to get his attention, make him aware of her presence. Their voices faded as the two men moved outside to inspect the cattle. Nora rushed to the window, peering between the wooden planks. In the fading light, she could see her father leading Zane toward the corral. Desperate, she returned to the door and began pounding on it. "Help, please, someone help me." She continued for several minutes until her hands were sore, but the thick oak door muffled her cries. Tears of frustration stung her eyes as she slumped to the floor. But then, inspiration struck. Her bedroom fireplace shared a chimney with the main fireplace downstairs. If she could create enough smoke, it might draw attention. Grabbing the quilt from her bed, she tore strips from it and stuffed them into the fireplace, then lit them with a match from the small box she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The fabric began to smolder, sending tendrils of smoke up the chimney and, she hoped, down into the main room below. Then, returning to the door, she renewed her efforts, pounding and calling for help. Outside, Zane Sutton walked the perimeter of the corral, evaluating the cattle with an experienced eye. At 26, he had spent the last 8 years driving cattle across the Western Territories, building a reputation as a fair but shrewd businessman. Something about Samuel Nichols put him on edge, but the cattle looked healthy and the price was reasonable. "They'll do," he said, turning back toward the house. "Let's settle up, and I'll have my men move them at first light." As they approached the porch, Zane noticed wisps of smoke curling from the chimney. "You've got a fire going on a warm evening like this?" Samuel frowned. "No, I don't," he stopped abruptly, his face darkening as he looked up at the second floor. That's when Zane heard the faint sound of someone calling for help and pounding on a door. He instinctively reached for the pistol at his hip, but Samuel was already rushing into the house. Zane followed, his senses on high alert. Inside, smoke was beginning to fill the parlor, not enough to be dangerous but definitely noticeable. The cries were clearer now, coming from upstairs. "What's going on, Nichols?" Zane demanded, his hand still resting on his gun. Samuel stood at the bottom of the stairs, blocking the way. "Nothing that concerns you, Sutton. My daughter is unwell. She gets these fits. I should see to her." But the desperation in the voice calling for help told Zane this was no fit. "That doesn't sound like someone who's sick. It sounds like someone who's trapped." Samuel's hand moved toward the rifle leaning against the wall. "I think you should leave, Sutton. We can discuss the cattle tomorrow." In one fluid motion, Zane drew his pistol. "I'm not leaving until I know what's happening here." For a tense moment, the two men faced each other, neither willing to back down. Then Samuel lunged for his rifle. Zane reacted instantly, closing the distance between them and bringing the butt of his pistol down on the older man's head. Samuel crumpled to the floor, unconscious but breathing. "Help, please." The voice was clearer now and distinctly female. Zane bounded up the stairs, following the sound to a locked door at the end of the hallway. "Stand back from the door," he called out. When he heard movement inside, he took a step back and kicked with all his strength. The old lock splintered, and the door flew open to reveal a young woman with wide, frightened eyes. Nora Nichols stood frozen, staring at the stranger who had just broken down her door. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and intense blue eyes that were now fixed on her with concern. "Are you all right, miss?" Zane asked, holstering his pistol. He He locked me in, Nora stammered, still clutching a torn strip of quilt in her hands. My father, he's going to kill me. Zane glanced back toward the stairs. Your father's unconscious for now, but we need to get you out of here. Can you ride? Nora nodded, her mind racing. This was her chance, perhaps her only chance to escape. Yes, I can ride, but he'll come after me. Let me worry about that. Zane's voice held a confidence that calmed her racing heart. Gather what you need, quickly. Nora didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed the small sack she had prepared days ago, which her father had overlooked in his anger. I'm ready. Zane led her downstairs, where Samuel still lay unconscious. Nora couldn't help but feel a pang of fear mixed with something else, not quite grief, but a sense of severing the last tie to her past. I can't just leave him like this, she said, hesitating. Zane gave her a measured look. From what I can tell, he locked his own daughter in a room and was ready to shoot me for trying to help her. What else has he done? Nora thought of the cattle buyer, his body now lying in an unmarked grave in the ravine. Terrible things, she whispered. He's not the man he once was. Making a decision, Zane pulled rope from his saddle bag and efficiently tied Samuel's hands and feet. This will hold him for a while, but not forever. We need to move. Outside, Zane's horse, a powerful black stallion, waited patiently. Do you have a horse? He asked. Maple's in the stable, Nora replied, leading the way. The familiar scent of hay and horses calmed her as she approached her chestnut mare, who nickered in recognition. She's ready to go. Within minutes, they had saddled the horses and were riding away from the ranch, Nora taking one last look at the only home she had ever known. The night was clear, with a half-moon providing enough light to see the trail ahead. My camp is about 5 miles west, Zane explained as they rode. I've got men there with the rest of my herd. You'll be safe. Nora studied his profile in the moonlight, trying to gauge whether she could trust this stranger who had just upended her life. Why did you help me, Mr. Sutton? Zane glanced at her, his expression serious. When someone calls for help, you answer, and it's just Zane. I'm Nora Nichols. She hesitated before adding, thank you for answering. They rode in silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of hooves on dirt the only noise in the vast, open country. Nora's mind whirled with questions and fears. She had escaped her father, but what now? Where would she go? How would she survive? As if sensing her thoughts, Zane spoke. We're driving the herd to Cheyenne. From there, you can take a train east if you've got family. I don't, Nora admitted. There's no one. Zane nodded, processing this information. Well, we'll figure something out when we get to Cheyenne, one step at a time. The distant glow of campfires appeared on the horizon, and soon they were approaching a sprawling cattle camp. Men moved about, tending to the herd and the evening chores. They looked up with curiosity as Zane rode in with Nora. Boys, Zane called out to the assembled cowboys, this is Miss Nichols. She'll be traveling with us for a spell. A grizzled older man with a silver-streaked beard approached. Everything all right, boss? Not exactly, Tom. I need to speak with you. Zane dismounted and helped Nora down from her mare, his hands strong and steady. Miss Nichols, this is Tom Wells, my foreman. Tom, see that Miss Nichols gets something to eat and a place to rest. As Tom led Nora toward the chuck wagon, she glanced back at Zane, who was already deep in conversation with 2 other cowboys, his expression grave. She had just put her life in the hands of a man she'd known for less than an hour. Yet somehow, she felt safer than she had in months. The camp cook, a cheerful Mexican man named Miguel, served her a plate of beans and biscuits, which she devoured with unexpected hunger. It had been days since she'd had a proper meal, and the simple food tasted like the finest feast. Thank you, she said, accepting a cup of strong coffee. This is delicious, Miguel beamed. "The señorita is too kind. It is only trail food." "It's freedom," Nora replied, surprised by her own words. The cook's eyes softened with understanding. "Ah, then it is indeed the finest meal." After eating, Tom showed her to a small tent. "It's not much, but it'll keep you dry if it rains. Boss says you're to have his bedroll. He'll bunk with the boys tonight." Nora's protest died on her lips as exhaustion suddenly overwhelmed her. The events of the day, the smoke signal, Zane breaking down her door, the escape from her father, all caught up with her at once. She barely managed to thank Tom before crawling into the tent and collapsing onto the bedroll. Despite her fatigue, sleep eluded her. Every sound in the camp, the low murmur of voices, the occasional lowing of cattle, the crackle of the campfire reminded her that she was in an unfamiliar place surrounded by strangers. What if her father regained consciousness and followed them? What if these men weren't as honorable as Zane seemed to be? She must have eventually drifted off, because she awoke with a start to the sounds of the camp stirring in the pre-dawn light. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came flooding back, and with it, a curious mixture of dread and exhilaration. Emerging from the tent, she found the cowboys already preparing for the day's drive. Zane stood at the center of the activity, issuing orders with the quiet authority of a natural leader. When he saw her, he approached, his expression guarded. "Good morning, Miss Nichols. I trust you slept well as could be expected, thank you." Nora smoothed her rumpled dress, suddenly self-conscious. "Mr. Sutton, Zane, what happens now?" Zane gestured for her to follow him to the chuck wagon where Miguel was serving breakfast. "We head north. I've sent 2 men back to keep an eye on your father's place. If he starts to follow, we'll know." Nora accepted a plate of flapjacks. "He will follow. He won't let me go easily." "I figured as much." Zane's jaw tightened. "What exactly did he do that made you so afraid?" Nora glanced around, aware of the other cowboys within earshot. "Can we speak privately?" Zane nodded, leading her a short distance away from the camp. In the growing light of dawn, Nora could see him more clearly than she had the night before. He was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps in his mid-20s, with strong features and eyes that seemed to see right through her. "He killed a man," she said without preamble. "A cattle buyer named Morris. Shot him and then buried the body in the ravine. I saw it happen and he knew I saw. That's why he locked me away." Zane's expression remained impassive, but his eyes darkened. "And you think he'd kill you too?" "I know he would." Nora wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the mild morning air. "He's not the same man he was before my mother died last year. It's like something broke inside him." "Grief can change a person," Zane acknowledged, "but it doesn't excuse murder." He considered her for a moment. "We're 10 days from Cheyenne at a good pace. You can stay with us until then, and I'll make sure you're set up with whatever you need to make a fresh start." The generosity of his offer stunned her. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Maybe I have a weakness for damsels in distress who set their bedrooms on fire to signal for help." Despite everything, Nora found herself smiling back. "It worked, didn't it?" "That it did." Zane's expression grew serious again. "But it's a dangerous world out here, especially for a young woman alone. My men are loyal and they'll respect you, but the trail is hard. Are you sure you're up for it?" Nora thought of the alternative, returning to her father or trying to make her way alone. Neither option held much appeal. "I don't have much choice, do I? Besides, I'm stronger than I look." Zane nodded, seeming satisfied with her answer. "We ride in 20 minutes. I'll have Miguel pack you some food and water for the day." As he turned to leave, Nora caught his arm. "Thank you, Zane, for everything." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or something deeper before he nodded and returned to the camp. The next few days established a routine. They would rise before dawn, eat a quick breakfast, and be on the trail as the sun crested the horizon. The cattle moved at a steady pace, guided by Zane's experienced cowboys. Nora rode alongside the chuck wagon most days, helping Miguel with meal preparations when they stopped. At first, the cowboys were wary of her presence, unaccustomed to having a woman in their midst. But Nora's willingness to work and her quiet determination gradually won their respect. She learned their names and stories: Tom, the grizzled foreman with a family waiting in Texas; Miguel, who sang Spanish ballads as he cooked; young Finn, barely older than her, who blushed whenever she spoke to him; and a dozen others, each with their own reasons for choosing the hard life of a cowboy. But it was Zane who intrigued her most. He kept a certain distance, always polite but reserved, yet she often caught him watching her with an unreadable expression. He led his men with a firm but fair hand, earning their loyalty through respect rather than fear. It was so different from her father's harsh ways that Nora found herself studying Zane's methods, trying to understand the kind of man who would risk himself to save a stranger. On the fourth night, as they made camp near a small stream, Nora was helping Miguel prepare the evening meal when Tom rode in at a gallop. "Boss," he called, dismounting quickly. "Riders coming from the south, 4 of them, moving fast." Zane was on his feet instantly, scanning the horizon. "How far?" "Maybe an hour behind us. Could be just travelers, but we can't take that chance." Zane turned to Nora. "Does your father have men who would ride with him?" Nora nodded, her heart sinking. "The Keller brothers. They've worked for him for years." Zane's expression hardened. "All right. Tom, get the men ready. I want guards on the herd tonight, double shifts. And Nora," he paused, meeting her eyes directly, "stay close to camp. If it is your father, he won't hesitate to snatch you if you're alone." The casual use of her first name wasn't lost on her, but there was no time to dwell on it. The camp burst into activity as men checked their weapons and positioned themselves strategically around the perimeter. Nora finished helping with the meal, but her appetite had vanished. As darkness fell, she sat near the main campfire, watching the flames dance while straining her ears for any unusual sound. Zane appeared at her side, offering her a cup of coffee. "You should try to rest. There's a long day ahead tomorrow." "I can't sleep, not knowing he might be out there." Nora accepted the coffee gratefully, the warmth of the cup comforting against the evening chill. "What will you do if it is him?" Zane settled beside her, his rifle resting across his knees. "Ideally, convince him to turn around and go home. And if he won't, then we deal with that when it comes." His voice was calm, but Nora could see the tension in his shoulders. "Your father doesn't strike me as a man who gives up easily." "He isn't." Nora stared into the fire, memories washing over her. "He was always stubborn, even before everything. My mother could handle him, though. She knew how to calm him when his temper flared. You must miss her. Every day." Nora hadn't spoken about her mother to anyone since her death. The words came haltingly at first, then more freely. "She was kind but strong. She taught me to read, to ride, to stand up for myself. When she got sick, it happened so fast. One day she was fine, and then she wasn't." Zane's voice was gentle. "And your father changed after she died." "It was gradual at first. He drank more, stayed away from the house for days at a time. When he was home, he was like a thundercloud, dark and threatening to burst. Then he started bringing men to the ranch, not good men. They would talk in whispers, plan things." "What kind of things?" Nora hesitated. She had already told Zane about the murder, but there was more things she had overheard, suspicions she had harbored. "I think they were rustling cattle. Maybe worse. There was talk about a stagecoach, about easy money." Zane's expression darkened. The Clearwater stage was robbed 2 months back. Driver killed, passengers beaten. I didn't know. Nora felt sick. How much blood was on her father's hands? I just knew something wasn't right. I started avoiding him, staying in my room or with the horses. Then Morris came to buy cattle and... She trailed off, the memory still too fresh. They sat in silence for a while, the crackle of the fire and the distant lowing of cattle the only sounds. Finally, Zane spoke again. You should know if your father shows up here, I can't promise how it will end. Nora met his gaze, seeing the concern there. I know. And as terrible as it sounds, I'm not sure I care anymore. He stopped being my father the day he locked that door. Zane reached out and briefly touched her hand, a small gesture of comfort that sent an unexpected warmth through her. Try to get some sleep. I'll keep watch. But sleep remained elusive. Nora lay in her tent, listening to the night sounds of the camp, her mind racing with fears and memories. It was near midnight when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of approaching horses. She sat up, heart pounding as voices rose outside. Pulling on her boots, she crept to the tent opening and peered out. In the moonlight, she could see Zane and Tom standing at the edge of camp, their hands hovering near their guns. Approaching them were 4 riders, and even in the dim light, Nora recognized the lead figure's broad shoulders and distinctive hat. Samuel Nichols had found them. Moving silently, she slipped out of the tent and edged closer, staying in the shadows. She needed to hear what was being said. My daughter, Sutton, her father's voice carried in the night air. You had no right to take her. As I recall, Zane replied evenly, she was locked in her room against her will. That doesn't strike me as the action of a caring father. What I do with my family is my business. Samuel's voice held the dangerous edge that Nora knew too well. Now step aside and let me speak to her. Miss Nichols is sleeping, Tom interjected. And even if she weren't, she's made it clear she doesn't want to see you. One of the men with her father, Jake Keller, she guessed, spoke up. Listen here, we didn't ride all this way for nothing. Either you produce the girl, or things are gonna get mighty unpleasant. Nora could see other cowboys emerging from their bedrolls, hands on their weapons. The tension in the air was palpable, like the charged atmosphere before a lightning strike. Before Zane could respond, Nora stepped forward into the light of the moon. I'm here, Pa. All heads turned toward her. Samuel's face, half hidden in shadow, showed a mixture of anger and something that might have been relief. Nora, come here, girl. We're going home. Zane moved to stand between them. Miss Nichols isn't going anywhere she doesn't want to go. Samuel's hand moved to his gun. This isn't your fight, cowboy. You made it my fight when you locked your daughter away, Zane replied, his voice hard. And when you murdered a man in cold blood. The accusation hung in the air. The Keller brothers exchanged glances, clearly unnerved by Zane's knowledge. She's been filling your head with lies, Samuel snarled. My daughter's always had a wild imagination. Nora stepped forward, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. Tell them, Pa, tell them what you did to Morris. Tell them about the stagecoach robbery, about the men who never made it to our ranch alive. For a moment, her father seemed genuinely taken aback. Then his expression hardened. You don't know what you're talking about, girl. I know enough. Nora's voice was steady now. I've spent the past year watching you become someone I don't recognize, someone Mother would have been ashamed of. At the mention of his wife, Samuel's face contorted with rage. Don't you dare speak of her, not after you killed her. The accusation hit Nora like a physical blow. What? She was fine until she started caring for you when you got sick. If you hadn't brought that fever home from town, she'd still be alive. Samuel's voice cracked with emotion that seemed genuine. You took her from me, and now you've turned against me too. For a terrible moment, doubt crept into Nora's mind. Had she somehow been responsible for her mother's death? The thought was unbearable, but Zane's steady voice cut through her confusion. "That's not how fever works, Nichols, and you know it. You're just trying to control her with guilt." Samuel's hand tightened on his gun. "Stay out of this, Sutton. Nora, come here now, or I swear to God, or what?" Nora interrupted, finding her voice again. "You'll lock me away again. Kill me like you killed Morris. I'm not coming back, Pa, not ever." With a roar of rage, Samuel drew his gun. Everything happened at once. The Keller brothers reached for their weapons. Zane shoved Nora behind him, and the air exploded with the sound of gunfire. Nora fell to the ground, her ears ringing from the shots. When she looked up, her father was on his knees, a look of shock on his face as he pressed his hand to his chest where blood bloomed across his shirt. Jake Keller lay motionless on the ground beside him. The other two men had their hands raised in surrender as Tom and the cowboys trained their weapons on them. Zane stood with his smoking pistol still aimed at Samuel. "It's over, Nichols." Samuel's eyes found Nora's, and for a fleeting moment, she saw something like clarity in them. "Eleanor," he whispered, using her mother's name. Then he toppled forward onto the dirt. Nora felt numb as she watched Tom check her father for signs of life, then shake his head. Samuel Nichols was dead. She should have felt something: grief, relief, anger, but there was only a hollow emptiness. The man who had raised her, who had once taught her to ride and read the stars, was gone. But the father she had loved had disappeared long before this night. Zane holstered his gun and turned to her, his face etched with concern. "Nora, are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to find words. "Tom, take care of things here," Zane ordered, "and keep those two under guard. We'll decide what to do with them in the morning." Gently he led Nora away from the scene, back toward her tent. "You should rest. It's been a long night." "I can't." Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "Every time I close my eyes, I see him falling." Zane hesitated, then guided her to the campfire, which still burned low. Settling her on a log, he draped a blanket around her shoulders before disappearing briefly. He returned with 2 cups of coffee laced with whiskey. "It won't help you forget," he said, handing her one, "but it might take the edge off." Nora took a sip, the burning liquid warming her from the inside out. "You killed my father." "Yes." Zane didn't try to soften it. "He was going to shoot you. I couldn't let that happen." "I know." And she did know. She had seen the murderous rage in her father's eyes, had known in that moment that he meant to kill her rather than let her go. "Thank you for saving my life." Again. They sat in silence for a long while, watching the flames. Finally, Nora spoke again. "Do you think he was right?" "About my mother?" Zane considered her question carefully. "I think grief can make people believe things that aren't true. Your mother chose to care for you because she loved you. That was her choice, made out of love. Your father couldn't accept that he had no control over what happened, so he needed someone to blame." His words made sense, but the seed of doubt her father had planted would take time to uproot. "What happens now? With the Keller brothers, I mean." "We'll turn them over to the authorities in the next town. With your testimony about the murder and the stagecoach robbery, they'll hang." Zane's tone was matter of fact. The West had its own justice, swift and final. "And me? What happens to me now?" It was the question that had been lurking in the back of her mind since she'd fled the ranch. Zane took a long drink of his coffee before answering. "That depends on what you want, Nora. The offer to see you safely to Cheyenne still stands. From there, you could go anywhere." "I have nowhere to go," she admitted. "No family, no friends. You could stay with us." The suggestion seemed to surprise even Zane himself. "I mean, with the outfit. We could use a hand with the cooking, and you've already proven you can handle yourself on the trail." Nora looked at him, trying to read his expression in the firelight. You'd let a woman join your cattle drive. A faint smile touched his lips. I'm the boss. I make the rules. For the first time that night, Nora felt something other than numbness, a small spark of hope. I'd like that. At least until I figure out what comes next. Then it's settled. Zane reached over and briefly squeezed her hand. Try to get some rest. Dawn will be here before we know it. This time, when Nora returned to her tent, exhaustion overcame her tumultuous thoughts, and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The morning brought a somber mood to the camp. While Nora slept, Zane and the men had buried Samuel Nichols and Jake Keller on a small rise overlooking the stream. The two surviving Keller brothers were bound and under guard, sullen but no longer defiant. Nora stood by her father's grave, a simple wooden cross marking the spot. She had no words to say, no prayers to offer. Instead, she placed a single wildflower on the fresh earth and turned away. Zane was waiting by the horses. We need to make up for lost time. Are you ready to ride? Nora nodded, grateful for his practical approach. There would be time for grief and reflection later. For now, the cattle needed to move and the trail waited for no one. They traveled hard that day, pushing the herd faster than usual to make up ground. Nora rode alongside Miguel's wagon, learning the art of making biscuits that wouldn't break teeth and coffee strong enough to raise the dead. That evening, as they made camp in a sheltered valley, Tom approached Zane with news. Town up ahead called Riverton. We can turn the Kellers over to the sheriff there. Zane nodded, glancing at Nora. You'll need to give a statement about what your father did. She had been expecting this, but the thought of recounting her father's crimes to strangers made her stomach tighten. I will. The next morning, they left the herd in the capable hands of most of the outfit and rode into Riverton with the prisoners. It was a typical frontier town, one main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a saloon doing brisk business despite the early hour, and curious onlookers watching their procession to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Davis was a burly man with a skeptical nature, but he listened carefully as Nora described what she had witnessed: her father's murder of the cattle buyer, the conversations she had overheard about the stagecoach robbery, and finally, her imprisonment and escape. That's a serious tale, Miss Nichols, he said when she finished. And these men were accomplices. They were, Nora confirmed. They helped him bury Morris's body. The Keller brothers glared at her but said nothing. They knew as well as anyone that their fate was sealed. Well, we've had telegrams about that stagecoach robbery, the sheriff acknowledged. And Morris's family reported him missing when he didn't return from his buying trip. I'd say there's enough here to hold them for the circuit judge. While Tom saw to the transfer of the prisoners, Zane took Nora to the town's only hotel. You should rest. We'll stay here tonight and rejoin the herd tomorrow. The hotel room was small but clean, with a real bed and a washstand, luxuries after days on the trail. Nora washed away the dust of travel and changed into the spare dress she had brought from home, suddenly conscious of her appearance in a way she hadn't been during the cattle drive. When she met Zane in the hotel dining room for dinner, she was aware of his appreciative glance. You clean up nice, Miss Nichols. As do you, Mr. Sutton. He had clearly taken advantage of the town's barbershop, his jaw clean-shaven and his dark hair neatly trimmed. They shared a meal that was a welcome change from trail food: roast beef, potatoes, and apple pie that almost rivaled her mother's recipe. As they ate, Nora found herself genuinely relaxing for the first time since her escape. The sheriff said something interesting after you left, Zane mentioned as they lingered over coffee. Apparently, your father's ranch is legally yours now. As his only heir, you inherit everything. Nora set down her cup, surprised. I hadn't even thought about that. It's a good piece of land. You could sell it. use the money to start fresh somewhere else. The thought of returning to the ranch, even briefly, filled her with dread. Too many painful memories lingered there. I don't think I could go back. Not now. Zane nodded, understanding in his eyes. You don't have to decide anything tonight. The ranch will still be there after we reach Cheyenne. After dinner, they strolled along the town's main street in the warm evening air. It was a simple pleasure that Nora hadn't experienced in years, walking freely, without fear of her father's disapproval or anger. "What will you do after Cheyenne?" she asked, curious about the man who had so drastically changed her life. Zane looked thoughtful. "Deliver the herd, collect payment, give the boys their shares. Then head south again, I suppose. There's always another herd to move. Don't you ever get tired of it? The constant moving, never settling in one place." "Sometimes," he admitted, "but it's the life I know. My father was a drover before me, taught me everything about cattle and the trail. When he died, I took over the outfit. It's been 6 years now. No thoughts of settling down, having a home of your own." A shadow crossed his face. "Once, there was a girl in San Antonio. We were to be married, but she decided a cowboy's wife wasn't the life she wanted." "I'm sorry," Nora said, genuinely sympathetic. Zane shrugged, but she could see the old hurt in his eyes. "It was for the best. She would have been miserable on the trail, and I would have resented giving it up." They had reached the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open prairie. The setting sun painted the landscape in hues of gold and crimson, a spectacular sight that drew them both to silence. Standing there, with the dying light warming her face and Zane a solid presence beside her, Nora felt a curious sense of peace. Despite everything, the trauma of her escape, her father's death, the uncertain future in this moment, she was exactly where she needed to be. "Beautiful," Zane murmured, but when she glanced at him, he wasn't looking at the sunset. He was looking at her. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of feelings that had been building gradually since the night he had broken down her bedroom door. Nora felt her heart quicken as Zane took a step closer, his gaze holding hers. "Nora," he began, then hesitated. "I don't want to take advantage." "You're not," she interrupted softly. "I know my own mind, Zane." He smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his serious face. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, but when Nora responded, wrapping her arms around his neck, the kiss deepened into something more urgent, more passionate. When they finally broke apart, both breathing harder, Zane rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since I first saw you standing in that doorway. Even though I was covered in soot and looked half wild," Nora teased, giddy with the new feelings coursing through her. "Especially then," he chuckled. "You were the most determined woman I'd ever seen, ready to burn down a house to escape." They walked back to the hotel hand in hand, the simple contact feeling both daring and right. At her door, Zane kissed her again, more briefly this time. "We should get some rest. Early start tomorrow." Nora nodded, though part of her wished the evening didn't have to end. "Good night, Zane." "Good night, Nora." He gave her one last smile before heading to his own room. Inside, Nora leaned against the closed door, touching her fingers to her lips where she could still feel the pressure of his kiss. For the first time in her life, she was truly free to choose her own path, free to follow her heart. And her heart, it seemed, was leading her straight to Zane Sutton. The next several days on the trail brought a new dimension to Nora's relationship with Zane. They were discreet, both aware of the cowboy's watchful eyes, but found moments to be alone. Dawn walks to check the perimeter, shared meals by the fire long after the others had turned in, brief touches as they passed each other during the day. Nora learned more about Zane with each conversation. He had been born in Missouri, but had spent most of his life on the move. His mother had died when he was 12, leaving him and his father to fend for themselves. He was well-read despite limited formal education, carrying a tattered copy of the Iliad in his saddlebag that he read by firelight. In turn, she shared stories of her childhood, the happy years before her mother's death, learning to make soap and candles, the time she'd hidden a litter of kittens in the barn, until her father grudgingly agreed they could stay to control the mice. "You've never known anything but that ranch," Zane observed one evening as they sat by a small creek away from the main camp. "Aren't you scared, heading into the unknown?" Nora considered the question. "I was at first, but now, it feels like an adventure. Like I'm finally living instead of just existing." Zane picked up a small stone and skipped it across the water. "And what do you want from this new life? Once we reach Cheyenne, I mean." It was a question Nora had been asking herself. The cattle drive would end, decisions would need to be made, paths chosen. "I'm not sure yet, but I know I don't want to go back to the way things were." "You could come with me," Zane said, his eyes on the rippling water. "South for the next drive." Nora's heart leapt at the suggestion. As a cook's helper, Zane turned to face her, taking her hands in his. "As more than that, if you wanted." The implication was clear, and Nora felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Are you proposing, Zane Sutton?" "Not exactly." He smiled, but there was nervousness behind it. "Not yet. We've only known each other a short while, but I know how I feel about you, Nora, and I think I hope you might feel the same." "I do," she admitted, the words coming easily. "I've never felt this way before." "Then come with me. We'll take time to know each other better, to be sure. And if after a while we still feel the same." He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. Nora leaned forward and kissed him, her answer in the gesture. When they parted, both were smiling. "Is that a yes?" Zane asked. "It's a yes," Nora confirmed. "I'll come with you." As they walked back to camp hand in hand, Nora reflected on the strange path that had led her here. A month ago, she had been a prisoner in her own home, with no hope of escape. Now she was choosing a future with a man who had literally broken down the door to her prison. Life, it seemed, could change as quickly as the Wyoming weather. The cattle drive continued northward, the days falling into a rhythm of early starts, long hours in the saddle, and evenings around the campfire. Nora's place in the outfit became more defined. She helped Miguel with meals, mended clothing torn during the day's work, and even took her turn watching the herd when extra hands were needed. The cowboys, initially wary of having a woman in their midst, gradually accepted her presence. Old Tom, in particular, took a fatherly interest in her welfare, sharing stories of his own daughter back in Texas. Young Finn overcame his shyness enough to teach her to play the harmonica, an instrument she proved surprisingly adept at. And then there was Zane. Their growing relationship did not go unnoticed by the men, but no one commented directly. Tom gave Zane a knowing look when he thought Nora wasn't watching. Miguel winked at her when Zane sought her out after dinner. The other cowboys exchanged glances but kept their thoughts to themselves. 8 days after leaving Riverton, they reached the outskirts of Cheyenne. The sprawling town was a shock after so many days in the open country. The noise, the crowds, the buildings rising 2 and 3 stories high. Zane led the herd to holding pens on the edge of town, while Tom rode ahead to inform the buyers of their arrival. Nora stayed with the chuck wagon, helping Miguel prepare what would be their last meal together as a complete outfit. "You will stay with the boss, yes?" Miguel asked as they worked, his knowing smile making Nora blush. "We've talked about it," she admitted. Miguel nodded approvingly. "He is a good man, the best I know. He deserves happiness, and so do you, Nina." That evening, with the cattle safely penned and the hard work of the drive behind them, Zane broke out bottles of whiskey he had been saving for the occasion. The mood around the campfire was celebratory, as the men drank, sang, and shared stories of drives past. Nora sat beside Zane, his arm casually draped around her shoulders, feeling truly part of something for the first time since her mother's death. These rough men with their weather-worn faces and calloused hands had become, in a strange way, a kind of family. "A toast," Tom called, raising his cup. "To the boss, for getting us here safe. To Miguel, for keeping us fed. And to Miss Nora, for bringing a bit of grace to our sorry outfit." "Hear, hear," the men echoed, raising their cups. Later, as the celebration wound down and men began to seek their bedrolls, Zane led Nora away from the camp. They walked in comfortable silence through the outskirts of town, the distant sounds of Cheyenne's saloons and dance halls providing a backdrop to their thoughts. "I'll conclude the sale tomorrow," Zane said, breaking the silence. "The men will get their pay and most will scatter until the next drive." "What about you?" Nora asked, though she already knew the answer. "I've been thinking about that." Zane stopped walking, turning to face her in the moonlight. "I received a telegram in Riverton. There's another herd waiting in Colorado, needs moving to Nebraska. Good money." Nora nodded, unsurprised. This was his life, after all. "When do we leave?" Zane's expression softened. "That's just it. I'm not sure we should." Confusion and a flicker of hurt crossed Nora's face. "You don't want me to come with you?" "No, that's not it at all." Zane took her hands in his. "I want you with me more than anything, but I've been thinking about what you said about never knowing anything but the ranch. Before you tie yourself to this life, to me, you should experience more of the world." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Cheyenne has opportunities. There's a women's college starting up. You could study, learn things your mother never had the chance to teach you. And I could come back for you after the drive." Nora pulled her hands away, surprised by the suggestion. "You think I need to be educated, that I'm not good enough as I am?" "That's not it at all," Zane said quickly. "I think you're remarkable, Nora. But I don't want you to choose this life, choose me just because I was the one who happened to break down your door. I want you to choose because you've had other options and still want this one." His words were unexpected but thoughtful, and Nora's initial hurt faded as she considered them. "And what if I already know what I want?" Zane smiled, touching her cheek gently. "Then I'm the luckiest man in Wyoming. But I need to be sure you're sure. 3 months. That's how long the drive will take. Stay here, explore the town, meet people. If you still want to come with me when I return, nothing would make me happier." Nora was silent for a long moment, torn between the desire to stay with Zane and the recognition that he was offering her a gift, the freedom to choose her own path without pressure or obligation. 3 months, she finally agreed. "But you'd better come back for me, Zane Sutton. Wild horses couldn't keep me away." He sealed the promise with a kiss, pulling her close against the chill of the night air. "Besides, you've got business here anyway. Your father's ranch, you need to decide what to do with it." The reminder of her inheritance brought Nora back to practical matters. "I suppose I should speak to a lawyer." "I know one in town, honest man. I'll introduce you tomorrow." Zane hesitated before adding, "And I've arranged lodging for you at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. It's respectable, clean, and she doesn't tolerate nonsense from her boarders or their callers." Nora raised an eyebrow. "You've been planning this." "Just considering options," Zane admitted. "I want what's best for you, Nora. And if what's best for me is you." His smile was answer enough. The next day was a whirlwind of activity. Zane concluded the sale of the cattle, paying his men their shares and bidding farewell to those who would not join him on the next drive. He introduced Nora to Jeremiah Foster, a lawyer who specialized in property matters, and to Mrs. Holloway, a stern-faced widow whose boarding house catered to respectable single women. "No gentlemen callers after 7, Mrs." Holloway informed Nora as she showed her to a small but comfortable room on the second floor. "Meals are served promptly at 7, noon, and 6. Laundry day is Tuesday." "Yes, madam," Nora replied, suppressing a smile at the woman's formidable demeanor. After settling her belongings still pitifully few, Nora met Zane for a final dinner before his departure the next morning. They ate at the hotel restaurant, both acutely aware of the coming separation. "Tom and Miguel are staying with me for the next drive," Zane told her as they lingered over dessert. "And young Finn. The rest are moving on, at least for now." Nora had grown fond of all three men and was glad they would be with Zane. "Tell them I'll miss them. And that Miguel had better keep up the standard of his biscuits without me there to help." Zane smiled, but there was sadness behind it. 3 months will pass quickly. Not quickly enough. Nora reached across the table to take his hand. "But I understand why you're doing this, Zane. And I appreciate it, truly." After dinner, he walked her back to the boarding house, both reluctant for the evening to end. On the porch, safely hidden from Mrs. Holloway's watchful eye by the shadows, they shared a lingering kiss. "Write to me," Nora whispered. "Tell me about the trail." "Every chance I get," Zane promised. "And you write too. Tell me about your adventures in Cheyenne." With one final kiss, they parted Zane to prepare for the early departure, Nora to her new temporary home. As she lay in the unfamiliar bed that night, listening to the sounds of the town settling for the night, Nora reflected on the extraordinary turn her life had taken. In just a few weeks, she had gone from prisoner to free woman, from isolated ranch girl to traveler on a cattle drive, and now to independent boarder in Wyoming's capital. And somewhere in all of that, she had fallen in love with the cowboy who had broken down her door. The next 3 months passed more quickly than Nora had anticipated, filled with new experiences and discoveries. With Mr. Foster's help, she arranged for the sale of her father's ranch, a transaction that left her with a surprisingly substantial sum. The cattle, land, and equipment fetched a good price from a family moving west from Pennsylvania, eager to establish themselves in the territory. Rather than keeping the money idle, Nora, on Mr. Foster's advice, invested a portion in Cheyenne's growing businesses and deposited the rest in the town's bank. For the first time in her life, she was financially independent. She did visit the women's college Zane had mentioned, sitting in on classes in literature, mathematics, and history. The experience was enlightening, but Nora soon realized that formal education, while valuable, was not her calling. Instead, she found herself drawn to more practical pursuits. Mrs. Holloway, discovering that Nora had a talent for organization and figures, enlisted her help with the boarding house accounts. This led to a part-time position at the general store, where the owner, Mr. Peterson, was impressed by her ability to manage inventory and negotiate with suppliers. "You have a head for business, Miss Nichols," he told her after she successfully haggled a better price for a shipment of fabric. "A rare quality in anyone, man or woman." Nora enjoyed the work, finding satisfaction in the orderly rows of merchandise and balanced ledgers. It was so different from the isolation of the ranch, with new people to meet and conversations to be had each day. True to his word, Zane wrote regularly. His letters described the progress of the drive, the challenges of crossing rivers swollen with late spring rains, the beauty of sunsets over the Nebraska plains. Each one ended with a reminder of his feelings for her and a countdown of the days until his return. Nora kept the letters tied with a ribbon in her dresser drawer, reading them often. She wrote back just as faithfully, sharing her experiences in Cheyenne, her decision about the ranch, her growing confidence in her abilities. As the weeks passed, Nora made friends among the other boarders, mostly young women working as teachers or shop girls, and even received 2 tentative offers of courtship from respectable young men in town. She declined both politely, her heart already spoken for. In her 3rd month in Cheyenne, Nora made a decision that would shape her future. Using a portion of her inheritance, she purchased a small but well-situated building on a side street off the main thoroughfare. The previous owner, a milliner who was moving to Denver, had left the shop fully equipped for business. "Are you sure about this, Miss Nichols?" Mr. Foster asked when she consulted him about the purchase. "Running a business is no small undertaking, especially for a woman." Nora finished with a smile. "My mother ran a household and helped with a ranch. Mrs. Holloway manages a boarding house. The lady who owned this shop before me built it from nothing. I think women are quite capable of business, Mr. Foster." The lawyer conceded the point with a chuckle. "Indeed they are. Well, if you're determined, I'll draw up the papers." By the time Zane's 3 months were nearly up, Nora had transformed the former hat shop into a different kind of establishment, a mercantile specializing in quality goods for ranches and homesteads. She had observed that, while Cheyenne had several general stores, none catered specifically to the needs of the outlying farms and ranches. Drawing on her experience growing up on a ranch, she stocked items that she knew were essential, but often hard to find: specialized tools, durable clothing, seeds suitable for Wyoming's harsh climate, and books on animal husbandry and crop management. She named it Nichols Mercantile and hired a young woman named Sarah, one of her fellow boarders, as an assistant. The shop opened 2 weeks before Zane was due to return, and to Nora's delight and surprise, it was an immediate success. Word spread quickly among the ranchers and farmers who came to town for supplies, and by the end of the first week, Nora had already needed to place orders for additional stock. "You found a niche, Miss Nichols," Mr. Peterson told her when she visited his store to purchase items she hadn't yet sourced from wholesalers. "Smart business." The day Zane was due to arrive, Nora closed the shop early and returned to the boarding house to change. She chose her best dress, a deep blue that complemented her eyes, and arranged her hair with more care than usual. Mrs. Holloway, passing her in the hallway, gave an approving nod. "You look lovely, Miss Nichols. I take it your cowboy returns today?" "Yes, madam." Nora couldn't suppress her smile. "His last letter said they'd reach town by midday. Well, remember the rules. No gentlemen callers after 7. But the landlady's stern expression softened slightly. "Unless, of course, his intentions are honorable." Nora hurried to the cattle pens on the edge of town, where Zane had said they would deliver the herd. As she approached, she could see a cloud of dust in the distance, and then the distinctive sight of cattle moving in a controlled mass, guided by mounted cowboys. Her heart leapt when she recognized Zane at the head of the procession, his familiar figure straight and tall in the saddle. He hadn't seen her yet, focused on guiding the herd into the holding pens. Nora waited patiently, watching as the cowboys expertly directed the cattle through the gates. When the last animal was secured, Zane dismounted, speaking briefly to Tom before turning toward town. That's when he saw her. For a moment, he stood frozen, as if unable to believe she was really there. Then his face broke into a smile that made Nora's heart race, and he crossed the distance between them in long strides. "You're here," he said simply, stopping just short of embracing her in public. "Did you think I wouldn't be?" Nora asked, drinking in the sight of him tanned from the sun, leaner after months on the trail, but still unmistakably her Zane. "I hoped. I prayed." His eyes roamed her face as if memorizing every detail. "You look beautiful, Nora. And you look like a man who needs a proper meal and a bath," she teased, though in truth, she found him handsome despite, or perhaps because of, the trail dust. Zane laughed, the sound warming her like sunshine. "Guilty on both counts. Give me 2 hours to conclude the sale and make myself presentable, and I'll meet you for dinner." "I have a better idea," Nora said, surprising herself with her boldness. "Come with me. I have something to show you." Curious, Zane followed her into town, pausing only to give instructions to Tom about finalizing the cattle sale. As they walked, Nora could feel his eyes on her, questions in his gaze. "You've changed," he observed. "Not just the dress or the way you've done your hair. There's something different about the way you carry yourself." Nora nodded, pleased that he had noticed. "I've changed in some ways. In others, I'm still the same." They turned onto the side street where her shop stood, and Nora stopped in front of the freshly painted storefront with its new sign, "Nichols Mercantile." Zane read the sign, then looked at her with dawning understanding. "This is yours." "It is." Nora couldn't keep the pride from her voice. "I sold the ranch and invested the money. The shop's been open for 2 weeks now." "Nora, that's remarkable." Zane's admiration was evident in his voice. "You've built something of your own." "I have." She unlocked the door and led him inside, watching as he took in the neatly arranged shelves, the polished counter, the ledger open for the day's accounts. "What do you think?" Zane walked slowly through the shop, examining the merchandise with an expert eye. "You've stocked exactly what ranchers need, things that are hard to find elsewhere." He turned to her, genuine respect in his expression. "You're going to do well here." Nora felt a flicker of uncertainty for the first time. "That's the question, isn't it? Whether I'll be here?" Understanding her meaning, Zane closed the distance between them, propriety forgotten as he took her hands in his. "That depends on what you want, Nora. These 3 months were for you to decide. And if I've decided that I want both, the shop and you," a shadow crossed Zane's face. "The trail is no place for a shop owner, and Cheyenne is no place for a cattle driver. I don't see how." Nora pressed a finger to his lips, silencing him. "I've thought about this, Zane. A lot. What if you didn't have to choose between the trail and staying in one place? What if there was a way to have both?" Intrigued, Zane waited for her to continue. "You know cattle. You know ranchers and their needs. What if, instead of driving other people's herds, you had your own ranch? Not far from town, close enough that I could manage the shop and we could have a home together." Zane looked surprised, then thoughtful. "A ranch of my own. I've considered it, but the initial investment, I have money from the sale of my father's property," Nora reminded him. "And connections now in Cheyenne. Mr. Foster told me about a property just 10 miles out of town that's available. Good water, good grazing land." Hope flickered in Zane's eyes, but he was still cautious. "Nora, I can't let you spend your inheritance on me. Not on you, on us." Nora stepped closer, resting her hands on his chest. "I love you, Zane Sutton. These 3 months have shown me that I'm capable of standing on my own, of building something from nothing. But they've also shown me that a life without you in it isn't the life I want." Zane's expression softened, his hands coming up to frame her face. "I love you too, Nora, more than I thought possible, and if you're sure this is what you want, I am. Then yes. Yes to the ranch, yes to a home together, yes to building a life with you." Zane's smile was radiant as he leaned down to kiss her, a kiss that held all the longing and love of their months apart. When they finally parted, both breathless, Nora couldn't help but laugh with pure joy. "Mrs. Holloway is going to be scandalized when I tell her I'm marrying a cowboy." "Marrying?" Zane raised an eyebrow, a teasing light in his eyes. "I don't recall proposing, Miss Nichols." "Well, Mr. Sutton," Nora replied with mock seriousness, "if you're planning to share a ranch and a life with me, I should hope your intentions are honorable." In response, Zane dropped to one knee right there in the middle of her shop, still dusty from the trail, his hat held over his heart. "Nora Nichols, you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known. You've faced danger and loss with courage, built a new life with determination, and somehow found room in your heart for a dusty cowboy who had the good fortune to break down your door. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of happiness blurred Nora's vision as she nodded. "Yes, Zane. Yes, I will." He rose and swept her into an embrace that lifted her off her feet, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down again, his expression grew more serious. "You know, when I first saw you in that locked room, I thought I was rescuing you," he said softly. "But now I think maybe you rescued me too from a life of always moving, never belonging anywhere or to anyone." Nora smiled, touching his cheek gently. "Perhaps we rescued each other." "Perhaps we did," Zane agreed, capturing her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "And now we build something new together." As the afternoon sun slanted through the shop windows, casting golden light across their entwined figures, Nora thought of how far she had come from that terrified girl locked in her bedroom. The journey had been difficult, sometimes dangerous, but it had led her here to a place of strength, independence, and love. Her father had locked the door against her, but in doing so, he had set in motion the events that would lead her to true freedom. And the cowboy who broke down that door had given her not just escape, but a future brighter than she could have imagined. Together, they would build that future, one day at a time. Epilogue. 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter floated through the open windows of the ranch house as Nora finished arranging flowers on the dining table. From outside came the rhythmic thud of hooves as Zane and his men brought in the small herd of cattle they'd been grazing in the north pasture. "Mama, Papa's home." 4-year-old Alina came running into the dining room, her dark hair so like her father's escaping from its ribbon. "I see that, sweetheart," Nora smiled, lifting her daughter to look out the window. "Why don't you go tell Sarah to bring the lemonade out to the porch?" As Alina scampered off to find their housekeeper, Nora checked on 2-year-old Samuel, napping in his small bed in the nursery. Named for her father, a choice that had helped Nora make peace with her past, the boy was the image of her, with golden brown hair and curious blue eyes. Satisfied that he was still sleeping soundly, Nora stepped onto the wide porch that wrapped around the ranch house. The Sutton Ranch had prospered in the 5 years since its establishment, growing from a modest operation to one of the most successful in the area. Zane's knowledge of cattle and Nora's business acumen had proven to be a powerful combination. Nichols' mercantile had flourished as well. Nora still owned the shop, though she had promoted Sarah's sister Martha to manager, allowing Nora to divide her time between the business in town and life on the ranch. She watched as Zane dismounted, giving instructions to Tom, who had stayed on as foreman before looking up at the house. When he saw Nora on the porch, his face broke into the smile that still made her heart skip a beat after all these years. "How are my girls?" he called, striding toward the house. "We're very well," Nora replied, "though I'm afraid your son is determined to sleep the day away." Zane bounded up the porch steps and swept Nora into a kiss that belied the presence of the ranch hands nearby. "He's storing up energy. That boy's going to be running circles around all of us soon enough." "Papa." Alina emerged from the house with Sarah behind her, carrying a tray of lemonade. "Did you see any wolves today?" "Not today, Princess." Zane scooped up his daughter, who had developed a fascination with wildlife. "But I did see a family of deer at the North Creek." While Alina peppered her father with questions about the deer, Nora offered lemonade to Tom and the other cowboys. The ranch hands tipped their hats in thanks, a respect earned through years of fair treatment and good management. Later that evening, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into nighttime quiet, Nora and Zane sat on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. His arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him, they enjoyed a moment of peace in their busy lives. "I had a letter from Miguel today," Zane mentioned. The cook had returned to Mexico 3 years earlier to care for his aging mother, though he wrote regularly. He's thinking of coming back north next spring. Says he misses real cooking for hungry cowboys. "We should invite him to stay with us," Nora suggested. "The children adore their Tío Miguel." Zane nodded, his fingers absently playing with a strand of Nora's hair. "I also heard from Mr. Foster. The rail line is definitely coming through next year. It'll make getting our cattle to market a lot easier. And bring more people to Cheyenne," Nora added. "Good for the shop." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the swing creaking gently as they rocked. Finally, Zane spoke again, his voice reflective. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been if I hadn't taken that cattle-buying job 5 years ago? If I hadn't heard you calling for help?" Nora considered the question. "Sometimes. But then I look at our children, our home, the life we've built together, and I can't imagine any other path." "Nor can I." Zane pressed a kiss to her temple. "Though I still maintain that breaking down that door was the smartest thing I ever did." "The second smartest," Nora corrected with a smile. "Oh, what was the first?" "Marrying me, of course." Zane laughed, the sound warm in the night air. "Can't argue with that logic, Mrs. Sutton." As they sat together under the stars, Nora reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From a locked room to a life of freedom and love, from fear to confidence, from isolation to family. The path hadn't always been smooth, but every step had led to this, a home filled with laughter, work that brought satisfaction, and a love that grew stronger with each passing year. Her father had locked the door against her, but Zane had broken it down and taken her away to a life better than she could have dreamed. And for that, Nora Sutton would be forever grateful.